there. But even so that, but don't talk about it is part of saying, don't make me uncomfortable. And of course that is the rupturing of white supremacy, to begin to speak about it. Have I had my 7 minutes yet?
Patrick? No, you have 2 more. From my count.
Okay.
Isn't Patrick keeping time?
One of the things that, I'll just make this last point about the cheerleaders is that we've said earlier, the reason they did what they did is because they could. And they know that. And white people, I'm a white person, I identify as white, know how that system works, actually. It's not to say we don't know, because that's actually incorrect. We're actually ignoring the effects to say that we don't know. And it's a contradiction, and whiteness actually operates by being slippery. There's nothing logical about it, and so it moves back and forth to keep itself intact. And it's that crazy making that we have to call out. The statement that comes from the resistance to calling it out is, this isn't about, the statement would be, this isn't about white supremacy, but I will use white supremacy whenever I like. And so it's that back and forth, it's that contradiction that we all have to name for what it is when it arises. So I'm an advocate of anti-racist pedagogy and anti-racist work, and I see that, and I know many of you are as well, working towards those things which we think will make a difference. I think I'll stop now.
Thank you. Thanks.
Well, I think I'll stand too. I guess it'll be easier to, since we don't have a mic. So I've been teaching at the University of Saskatchewan for 22 years, and before that I actually taught here at the University of Regina in Suntec. And so I started out teaching cross-cultural education, so very familiar with that kind of cultural discourse, but always interested in the race relations, I guess is one of the words that's used in the title of this presentation, that I grew up in. So as I was thinking about what I was going to say here today, some questions that I thought about and posed to myself. Does critical race theory and anti-racist education have a place in the education of, for, and about Aboriginal people? Because I think that's an ongoing issue here in a Canadian context and also in a Saskatchewan context. And is racism and white supremacy a problem that gets in the way of Aboriginal people living a life with dignity? And then another question that I often ask myself over and over again in terms of the research that I do is, how much evidence and what sorts of evidence are required that would compel good folks in education to acknowledge that race is a factor in achieving educational inequality? And why do we have to keep making these claims that actually race matters, given the history of colonization? And so I guess I'm interested in, as Du Bois states, I think it's in Souls of Black Folks, he says that he was interested and motivated by asking, exploring how he and other African Americans get constructed as a social problem. And I thought, yeah, that's who we are as Indigenous people. We're constructed as a social problem. I want to say more about that in a bit. So I grew up in a social and political environment, went to school in an environment that was marked by race, in which white supremacy and relations of superiority and inferiority were simultaneously palpable and yet ignored, where racialized relations were always being performed, at times what seemed like through an opaque veil, and other times right in the light of day. And I learned in so many ways who that who we were as Indigenous people were less than the white folks who lived among us, whose families and communities were supported to become self-sufficient, had the opportunity to live with dignity, at the same time that my father, my very own father, my mother's father, and many of our people were being criminalized for infractions of all sorts of laws and policies that were imposed to curtail the self-sufficiency and dignity of our people and our people's ability to provide clothing, food, shelter for their families. White families had nice families with nice houses and nice cars and nice clothes and nice lunches, and they were the epitome of success. While white histories under the pseudonym of the life of the pioneer were valorized, meanwhile their history that had to do with the oppression and the violence committed towards Indigenous people was and is still, if not grossly, distorted, erased, and completely silenced. So right in that story, I am doing critical race theory. It's counter-story, it's naming white supremacy, and it's providing the importance of that history, because we need history in order to do our anti-racism education. So with the recent Truth and Reconciliation around residential school, I am expecting, and I already can see, that we as critical race educators and Indigenous educators will face enormous challenges in teaching in public schools about that violence and that cultural genocide that was committed through residential schools on behalf of white settler Canadians. Residential schools were about destroying our families and communities. They were part of a larger colonial project to clear the land of Indigenous peoples, to take the land as a national resource open for capitalist expansion and development. And this and that history will either be resisted, neutralized through a process of celebrating diversity. And that is a process and a practice that is well established in Canada and in this province. And so I'm interested then, how do we teach this difficult knowledge? What will disrupt that white innocence and race to innocence and goodness? And so, so it's because of these histories and these social relations that enforced relations of racial inferiority and superiority that we need anti-racism. So I guess in some ways that is what I'm doing, is the pitch. Because it still needs to be made. And the fact that we still have to make it. I think that is what anti-racism education is about. We need that critical race history to do, as Gramsci stated, an inventory of the traces upon our body. That is why Native studies and ethnic studies are so important in our education. That's why we need an integrated anti-racism that's grounded in a critical analysis of our political economy that creates inequality and relies on the production and reproduction of ideologies and social practices that construct some people as the undeserving poor, which are invariably racialized and gendered. So I think a critical anti-racism enables us to explore in a Canadian context the multiple ways in which Indigenous bodies are constructed as unworthy, as bodies not worth living. It's distressing the degree to which we avoid identifying that race matters in a Saskatchewan Canadian context. When you think about the inquiries of into Aboriginal deaths in custody, when you think about the Stone Child inquiry that I spoke about earlier this afternoon, when you think about the high incarceration of Aboriginal people, when you think about the death of Brian Sinclair sitting in an emergency room in a hospital for 3 days and he dies there unattended, when you think about the high levels of Indigenous people in foster care, and like, never mind the mascot issue and this cheerleader issue, and often the institutional response is, well, let's do cultural diversity training. And I'm wondering, like, what the heck does cultural diversity have to do with the dehumanization of Indigenous people? And the dehumanization, I mean, Fanon writes about this, like colonialism and racism and white supremacy is about dehumanization. And no amount of us, you know, trying to convince the colonizer of the value of our cultural traditions will make a difference, because the power of the institutions that make the laws, make the policies, rests there in colonialism. So part of what I've been interested in writing about and is sort of like the regulation of Indigenous teachers, the regulation of Indigenous bodies to shut down critical race discussions in education. And so I'm working on a paper that is using the work of Sarah Ahmed, to talk about the politics of the construction of the positive happy Indian and the construction of the bad angry Indian. Bad angry Indian being the Indian, I'm a bad angry Indian. And so I think part of the intervention that anti-racism can do is to challenge the continuing of blaming the victim. And this is another area of work that I'm interested in doing, is like, how is it that Indigenous people, as Du Bois wrote about, how do we get constructed as a social problem, as the problem? And you can see it, you can trace that history in terms of how Indigenous students get constructed, how Indigenous people get constructed. As you know, in the early years of public integration, we were failing because we had too much culture, right? We didn't do well in residential schools because we were so culturally different. Never mind the quality of this education that was provided. So we were too different, and then we went into public schools, and then Indian control came along, and the issue got cast that we didn't have enough culture. So we went from having too much to not enough. And now when I look at Saskatchewan education policy that's coming out, now I see us being constructed as too damaged, too traumatized. So that constant reinvention of who we are at Indigenous bodies as deficient, as inadequate, which is what Zeus spoke about earlier as the subhuman, like how we're constantly being reproduced as a subhuman. And so I guess when I think about this, I think I've taught non-Indigenous, I've taught white students for the last 20 years, 22 years, I've taught Indigenous students, and I think who should do this work? And it's a different kind of work when you're working with Indigenous students and white students. I mean, there's some overlap in terms of the basic education, but it's also different. And I think that, 20 years ago, one of my colleagues said, we were talking about, as a faculty, what to do about, what to do in Aboriginal education, and this, well-meaning faculty member said, well, do you want me to go to a sweat? And I remember I didn't have a good answer except no.
You won't even make it.
That will not stand in for the critical work that we have to do around looking at your own history. And so, as educators, like Zeus was asked this afternoon, how do we participate in harm reduction? Like, just begin by learning your own history. Like, begin by reading Clearing the Plains, begin by reading As Long as the Rivers Flow and the Land Lasts. Like, read the history of the violence, the tremendous violence. And then you will understand your connection to the people in my town on 20th Street, or here, I guess, in Regina would be the North End. because you're, you know, and now I'm talking to white people. There's a very close connection. So thank you. That's.
So I'm a visitor. So thank you for your hospitality and warmth. Literally, it's warm in here. And so this is amazing. I don't think I've given a talk in this context quite like this. So
I was learning.
yeah. So it's nice to know that you could advertise a talk about race and racism and people would come. Right? I.e. not run away, but run toward. So I want to frame my comments around the recent episode, even a minor crisis that the community seems to be experiencing. Because I think of crises in the way that I'm glad you mentioned Gramsci, because I think crises expose opportunities. Right? Crises expose not just a violence that was done, but a way to then enter an ongoing problem through that example. And so I don't always think of racist episodes as necessarily just limiting us. It actually exposes what's going on every day. In fact, but that it sharpens what's actually going on every day because it was so, let's say, overt or egregious. So I'm going to, and I understand maybe some of the cheerleaders could be in this room. You don't have to raise your hands. Could be in this room right now. So I'm glad to be able to speak on this, especially as it's not my own context, right? And so I think Verna's right that we're looking for taking an inventory about a relation that deposited its traces before you and I got here, right? That deposited its traces before Monday. And our second task is to find the key to that office, right, where the inventory takes place. We don't have the key yet. So what I want to talk about in 7 minutes is this idea I've been playing around with, which is the notion of the white intellectual alibi. So oftentimes when you get to a table to talk about race and racism with white folks, as I do often, almost daily, partly it's because it's the work I do, partly it's also because I, in my own way, as many people of color here, have experienced mobility. You've climbed the social ladder, and the higher you climb on the ladder, the less of you are there, actually. And so I find myself sometimes in a conversation as really only one of the few people of color. I do this a lot. And I think that whites are very scared of looking racist. That's interesting to me because that's enough to paralyze most whites from entering a conversation like this. I'm glad you're here. But I believe what we've been talking about is the importance of anti-racism, not trying to avoid looking racist. That's a different project. and I think what happened with the cheerleaders is that they were caught. And there's nothing worse to a white person's mind than getting caught looking racist, right? Because then it drags up all these thoughts that, self-doubt. I thought I was one of the good ones. Am I really racist? And I'm sure that's going on in the heads of the cheerleaders who probably didn't mean any intent. So this is not about intent. It's about history. This is about social patterns of behavior that then we can focus on. But I think one mistake is to focus on it as a problem of attitudes and behaviors and leave it at that, because that would have been bad enough. What Claude Steele might call stereotype threat, or these kinds of racial transgressions that whites perform. I think that would have been bad enough. But I think what I know about racial attitudes is they're the tip of the iceberg. All right? So that phrase "tip of the iceberg" means there's a larger piece of the iceberg underneath, and that larger piece of the iceberg, I feel like, really is what I try to keep my eye on. That's the prize, right? And these moments, these crises, these episodes give us a glimpse of that submerged part of the iceberg, which I call the history and structural, right, face of racism. But it's enough for white folks to see what happened, because I'm sure also, right, and I think I'm probably correct, that even if you weren't one of the cheerleaders, it scares you because, right, you may have been in that position at some point, it was uncomfortable, maybe it wasn't as bad as that, and you certainly are probably saying to yourself, "Whew, I'm glad it was them and it wasn't me," right? And so that gets us into kind of a white psyche about race and racism, the fear of getting caught, right? And the way I made sense of this recently is by using this concept of the white intellectual alibi. Okay, who watches Law and Order? I know it's a New York based, but I'm assuming it comes up here. Right. Or any show. You have to ask me which version, right? There's like, it's like CSI, there's 4 of them.
Yeah, NCIS.
So, or any murder show that you can think of. The first question they ask a suspect is, where were you? Right? So they ask him or her for an alibi. Right? And if you can prove that if the murder happened at midnight over there, and you were over there at 12:01, you couldn't have possibly done it. You are innocent. And what happens is, so alibi is actually in the literature. People who read Roland Barthes, the semiotician from France, wrote about alibi as a spatial metaphor. Because you couldn't, and it's also temporal, right? Because you couldn't have been there at that time, at that place, at the same time that the murder happened. So what I think is going on here, that Michelinos Zambilas and I wrote about, the notion of the alibi is, people see those cheerleaders, and then they may not have noticed that it may have been, that it's problematic, but certainly somebody pointed it out just recently. And so white folks who see that say, well, I wasn't there. Right? So what happens is you create an alibi out of those cheerleaders. So that's who the real racists are. Right? And the notion that one could be very much involved in that way, that relation, that repeating of history and its injuries. So this is not about a legacy of racism, this is about living racism now, like a living racism, a continuing racism. So I think what we try to make sense of is how that fear of looking racist then enters the viewer of the cheerleader. So the cheerleaders get objectified as the real face of racism, right? Often, for example, I understand too that how like working class, even rural whites from the movie Deliverance, get framed as the real racists. Those vulgar, uncivilized racists. You know, so people on the coast, New York, L.A., San Francisco, whites get start to understand themselves as we're sophisticated, and you maybe, but and so so the point I'm making is that yeah, sure, what they did was racist. So I'm calling it that. You don't get off that easily. So it was that, but I think we have to take it as a symptom of that larger iceberg. It's only really the tip, and I think to take it as an opportunity to talk about racism in all of its manifestations. And that's one of them, surely. We could talk about how that relates to other acts of racism. But I think the way people of color often experience such things is that it is a signal for a larger problem, right? A larger act of dispossession, right? And that this cultural transgression by the cheerleaders, right, is itself only a symptom of a larger problem. So I think we have to take it there, talk about it as a specific act, as a specific transgression, but relate it to a larger historical narrative about the dispossession and dishonoring of people of color, particularly in this case, Aboriginal, Native, Indigenous populations, right? And so that's how I've been trying to make sense of the recent episode. And I want to end this. I think I have a minute. I want to end this by saying that I think there's a lot of discussion of how that act, that picture, I mean, the picture reminds me of some of the postcards we know about lynching.
Yeah.
Where, right, young 5, 6-year-old white girls and boys and their parents are having a picnic after. And there's something that reminds me of that. It's not the same. It's not the same. I'm not going to equate it. That would be wrong. But I think there's that kind of, smiling into the camera whiteness that reminds me of that. And I think what I want to focus on is we've been talking a lot about how that action creates again and reinvents, right, in a problematic way, indigenous people. The point I want to leave you with is those cheerleaders recreated themselves as white. All right? So that the notion that their act, once again, stereotypes and caricatures Native folks, that's true. But I want to displace that a little bit and say, no, They recreated whiteness, they recreated themselves in that narrative of whiteness. They recreated all of you who are white here, right? And so I think that we have to get away from this notion of, I don't want to look racist, and kind of disavow that that's the scariest thing. I think the scariest thing is that this dehumanizes all of us, and that this makes us all less human. Some more human than others, right? I said that earlier. Some more human than others. But I think at the end of the day, this makes us all less. So.
Thank you.